Gabon's army has announced on state TV that it is reopening the country's borders, which were closed in the wake of the military coup that ousted ex-President Ali Bongo. Now, former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, Kadri Desire Ouedraogo, has blamed the resurgence of military coups in Africa on poor governance and a sit-tight syndrome by political leaders on the continent. The former chairman of Economic Community of West African States, Ecowas, said the way to discourage military coups on the continent is for the democratically elected leaders to govern their people with honesty and respect the opinion of the people through elections. He called for a revival of established protocols with a view to strengthening peer review mechanisms on the continent.
We are following very closely the developments in West Africa, and especially regarding peace and stability in our region. You have spoken about the situation in Gabon. Although Gabon is not part of West Africa and Ecowas, the case there is similar to what is going on in Niger Republic and other countries in West Africa. I must say that the reasons of this situation range particularly on the way we conceive democracy. Have many things to be corrected. But you know that ECOWAS has adopted since 1991 the declaration of political principles that will set the path of our integration. And you know that peace and are necessary for economic development. So ECOWAS has adopted a protocol in 2001 on democracy and good governance. And the authority of head of states sees that these protocols are applied and by all member states. And indeed, ECOWAS reached a lot of achievement. Till the years 2012, all the 15 countries of ECOWAS were ruled by democratically elected presidents. But unfortunately, in the last 3 years, we have experienced coup d'etat in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, and now in Niger. I think that we have to look the reasons of this. I think they are based on governance and the way we process it. In order to have stability, you have to carry out transparent, credible elections, and then those elected after these elections should govern the countries with honesty and rightfulness so that we can have a good governance. Good governance elections are the basis on which we can develop democracy in West Africa. But when crises arrive like this, ECOWAS has to play its role and help the concerned countries to come back to democracy again by negotiation, by diplomacy, by using the protocols of the community. And I think is what is going on. And I want to pay tribute to all these mediators, negotiators, who are trying to make sure that we can settle all these issues peacefully to the interests of the West African people and to the interests of ECOWAS. I believe that the ECOWAS protocols have already set the rules and the regulation regarding elections. And I believe that if every country go by these rules, there will not be crisis because we would have applied true democracy. But if we do not follow these principles, then we run the risk of finding ourselves in the kind of situation we are in now. This is the reason why it is urgent to call on all African leaders to apply true and sincere democracy. This starts, as I said, by organizing free, fair, and transparent elections, allowing people to express their choice and respecting the choice of the people. Once these elections are credible and accepted by all the candidates, then you have the chance to have a peaceful running of your program, electoral program. But again, good governance is necessary for democratic stability. Do not follow the principle of good governance, then you have always problems. So the situation in West Africa, you see, in ECOWAS, we tried as much as possible to see if in the constitution of each member state, it could be possible to introduce a term limiting the terms of the ruling leaders. I believe that this reform is undergoing so that if it is adopted, it will allow us to turn the page of all these disputes and concentrate ourselves on the development of our people and our countries. So, but I am sure that if we do not follow strictly democracy, then we will not have a true development in Africa. So democracy and good governance are prerequisites for development and stability in West Africa. And this is what ECOWAS is doing by his own additional protocols. But I agree that this protocol has to be revised in order to allow ECOWAS to follow more strictly the electoral processes and also the governance in the member states. This has to be revised, and I'm informed that the revision is on the way. I must just hope that this revision of the protocols allow ECOWAS to monitor more closely what is going in member states so that we can avoid this stability, because without instability, there is no development. This is the reason why the West African Elders Forum is trying at its best to entertain a dialogue, to advise sitting leaders, to advise opposition leaders, and also to advise the people and political parties so that they build a consensus before election. And after the election, there should be a possibility of the people to demand results and also to have their way to say if the way the country is ruled is good or not. We have to have this freedom. Without freedom, there is no. I hope that ECOWAS has reached this point a few years ago, but unfortunately, we are witnessing this coup. So we think they have to be managed, help the transition to go back to true democracy, through transparent election, and then also good governance after the elections.
Well, let's discuss the issue further, as I'm now being joined by Professor Abiodun Adeniyi of Bayes University here in Abuja. Good to see you, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, looks like the African leaders have started talking for the comments we've just heard. He's saying that the peer review mechanism is very essential here, and he's also saying that they should do what the people want. Now, take us back to some of the key takeaways he's raised there. There's a recipe, and it's so simple. And he says, do what the people want, and you go back to the Constitution.
Yeah, no doubt. I agree with him to some extent. But doing what the people want can actually be contextual, because you can also have a military regime doing what the people want. And what do the people want? Good governance, a provision of infrastructure, utilities, and ensuring that they are able to fulfill their life expectations, able to make ends meet. Those things can be found in either of whether civilian or military regime. But what we want in Africa, or largely the ideal democracy, envisages freedom, freedom, which is an inalienable rights that we often talk about, free speech, right to life, right to expression, and of course, the inclusion and integration of the citizens in the governance process. And that's why we often say democracy is closest to godliness in terms of governance. But I think the problem we have in Africa, or maybe in West Africa as the case seems to be emerging now, is we have not been able to decide really what we want. Is it democracy or development? And I remember the revered Professor Bolaji Akeyemi alluded to this during the week. Sometimes we can have development without democracy. We can also have democracy without development. But what do we want? We have opted for democracy, but in opting for democracy, what kind of democracy do we want? Is it one that apes and idolize, foreign models, Western models particularly? One that is not ingrained in our cultures, in our particularities and peculiarities? These are the things that I think we need to address so that we can rest the question of coup, maybe forever, but of course we're continuing to have coups. It was dominant in the 80s and the 90s. They are coming back now because our institutions are still consistently weak. We have had leaders who are largely self-aggrandizing, who care less about institutional growth, about system growth, about upping the ante at the level of our values, at the level of our virtues, such that when there's an intervention again, you see the populace appearing feeble and fickle-minded, somewhat accepting the interventionist again. So those values, those institutions are still very weak. That's why we see this back and forth, this very weak system that is unable to resist interventions like this. Do not forget, it could just be a mere adventure. Were it not for the strength of the American institution, a certain Donald Trump will have disrupted the seamlessness, the supposed seamlessness of the American democracy. But what I think is lacking in our own African system is that the system is still very weak, the institutions are very weak, the values we subscribe to are still primitive, and we are still undecided about the kind of democracy we want, one that is ingenious to us, reflective of our particularities at the level of culture, religion, and maybe histories, as the case could be.
And it looks like that's one of the key concerns he also raised. If you recall, he also said that we must govern the people with some sense of honesty, and of course listening to the opinion of the people as expressed through elections. Honesty is one of the key things here, key component, which is almost absent in our democracy here. So at the end of the day, it will seem as if we're trying to redefine what democracy is once it comes to Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. See, honesty, integrity, credibility, they are all part of it. They are all part of elements needed for institutional growth. And sometimes when you have these in abundance, when it's become very obvious, it tends to consciously or unconsciously ward off intervention is often represented in the military. In those days, we often talk about two broad political parties. We put military as one. Political sciences often talk about this. We say military is one and the civilians are the other. But it seems to, it faded away in the last 2 decades, because of the rise of democracy in Africa. But now we are witnessing a reversal. Why are we having this reversal? And that's the point we're making. What do we really want? Is it democracy or development? If we want democracy as it seems to be, then we have to be ready to abide by all the tenets as represented in ideal democracies around the world. Ideal democracy around the world is not even in the United States or the United Kingdom, for instance, widely regarded as a bastion of democracy. But we talk about countries in the Nordic, Scandinavian bracket, maybe Sweden, maybe Norway, and the rest of them like that. And sometimes when we admire development, we mention Singapore, we mention China, we mention Russia, but these are not democracies. They are not the ideal democracy that we want. But in terms of development, they are up there. Singapore, for instance, under Lee Kuan Yew, was not a democracy, but it brought about development. But where was the place of freedom? Now we can also refer to nearer home, Rwanda. We can see development, we can see peace, we can see progress, but it's not the kind of ideal democracy.
So in other words, sorry to cut you there, Professor Adeniyi, now you're mentioning these countries and these individuals that are still very much in our memory. Are we now saying that sometimes you need a little bit of despotism, because some of these figures you just mentioned, they're actually despotic, and still we celebrate them.
And that's the question I'm asking us to ask ourselves, really. What do we want, Do we want a situation where, because sometimes there are reasons for us to even ask ourselves a question that this kind of freedom that we seem to be enjoying, is it not excessive? Is it the kind of freedom that we really want? The one area in which you can see this reflected is in the area of the revolution in the media. Rise in communication technologies, where you're having different levels of disinformation and misinformation and dangerous malinformation. Is that the kind of freedom that you say it's okay? Is it okay for us? If it's okay for us, fine. But if it's not okay, why can't we be creative? Really, we're already asking questions about our own democracy 24 years after. We're raising questions about the kind of legislature we want. Is it a unicameral or bicameral? Sometimes we're also raising questions about the structure. Is the structure good enough for us? Sometimes we're raising questions about the cost of our democracy. Is this something that we can afford as a people?
So it's always in a state of flux.
In a state of flux.
And that conversation must continue.
Must continue, but we have to be bold enough to take decision, really. But can we really take that decision? Our democracy has grown no doubt in 24 years in terms of longevity. I keep saying this, but character is still a problem. And character will improve if it is characterized, if it is typified by integrity, by credibility, especially of the mechanism that leads to succession. Transition from one set of people to the other. That one has to be strengthened. And I want to believe there are opportunities for us to work at it, because there's the common saying out there that I agree with, that the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy, not interrupting democracy. Because if you interrupt democracy, you take us years back, and it's inimical to the growth and development of any nation. Nations largely like a system of government that is somewhat representative, that is somewhat inclusive, of citizens, citizens' desire, citizens' expectation. And democracy is representative of this largely. That's why you find even in the so-called theocratic or despotic states, you still find semblances of democracy to some representation, maybe some kind of parliament. You may say it is not ideal, but of course it brings in the element of consultation, elements of conversation, which also gives you a ring of inclusion. It tells you that democracy is somewhat closest to godliness. But what type do we really want in our own system? We have to be bold to think about it properly. Do not forget the question of proportional representation is also being talked about, which is why losers in this country find it very difficult, to accept that they have actually lost election. Should we have proportional representation so that they will have a place, in the sharing of the cake, as the case like we often want to say, or not? So what do we want really at the end of the day is a conversation that will continue. But I think that it's not bad if we are bold enough to continue to tweak our own as we advance in building and entrenching and consolidating our democracy. But overall, the solution to it is not interrupting or truncating democracy, but it's more democracy.
Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, many thanks for your time.
My pleasure.